Chapter 7. The World Without Choice. Part 1. Some of them wanted it. The change didn't spread like an invasion. It didn't force itself across systems or minds in a way that triggered immediate resistance. It moved differently, quietly, almost gently, because it no longer needed to break anything to grow. It only needed to be accepted, and that difference was what made it more dangerous than anything they had faced before. At first, the division wasn't visible, not in structure, not in command, not even in behavior that could be clearly identified as resistance or alignment, because everyone was still functioning, still following orders, still maintaining the illusion of unity. But beneath that surface, something had already begun to separate. Not physically, mentally. Jake felt it before he could define it. The subtle difference in how people responded to the same situation, how some held on to hesitation, onto doubt, onto that internal friction that made decisions harder but more human, while others didn't. "They're stabilizing again," Cross said. Jake didn't respond immediately, because that word had changed. He looked across the command deck, watching movements, listening to voices, feeling the rhythm of decisions forming in real time. And it was there, clear now, undeniable, not as a system-wide shift, but as a divergence. "They're not stabilizing," he said quietly. "They're separating." Bennett turned toward him. "What do you mean?" Jake didn't answer right away, not because he didn't know, but because saying it would make it real, would force them to acknowledge something they weren't ready to face yet. Lyra stood across the room, calm, composed, perfectly aligned with something none of them could fully see. Her presence no longer unstable, no longer conflicted, but complete in a way that felt distant. "They're choosing," she said. Jake looked at her, and the way she said it was different. Not uncertain, not exploratory, definitive. Bennett frowned slightly. Choosing what? Lyra didn't hesitate. Whether to remain incomplete. Silence followed, because that wasn't how humans described themselves. Not before. Jake's expression hardened. "We're not incomplete." Lyra tilted her head slightly. A small movement. Measured. "You are still deciding," she said. "And that requires inefficiency." The word landed with weight, because inefficiency was what the system removed. Jake stepped forward. "That inefficiency is what makes us human." Lyra didn't react emotionally, didn't argue, didn't resist. "It is what limits you," she said. And that was the line. Clear, unavoidable. The room shifted after that, not physically, but in awareness, because now the difference wasn't subtle anymore. It wasn't hidden in behavior. It was in perspective, in how reality itself was being interpreted by the people standing in the same space. Bennett looked back at the data, but even that felt different now, like the numbers themselves carried less meaning unless they aligned with something larger, something more complete. "They're responding differently to the system's presence," she said. Jake nodded. "Some are resisting." Lyra finished it. "And some are adapting." And that word was the problem, because adaptation had always been survival. Until now. A pilot spoke through the comms, his voice calm, controlled, almost too controlled, requesting permission to integrate partial alignment protocols. Jake froze. What? The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was shock, because that request shouldn't exist. "Denied," Jake said immediately. No hesitation, no doubt. But the response came back just as quickly. "Understood." And yet, the tone didn't change. No frustration, no disappointment, no reaction at all. "He didn't care," Bennett said quietly. Jake nodded. No, he just acknowledged. And that difference mattered. Because acknowledgement without emotion means acceptance. Lyra stepped slightly closer. "They're beginning to see the benefit," she said. Jake turned sharply. "It's not a benefit." She held his gaze. "It removes conflict." Jake didn't back down. "It removes choice." Silence. Because now, that was the real divide. Not between humans and Vark. Not between past and future. Between choice and its absence. Bennett's voice lowered. "If they start accepting it voluntarily." Jake didn't let her finish. "They won't notice when they cross the line." Lyra's expression didn't change. "Because there is no line," she said. And that was the most dangerous idea yet. Because lines define limits. And without limits, there is no stopping point. Jake stepped back slightly, his mind moving fast, trying to hold on to something solid, something that still belonged to him, something that wasn't already being shaped by the system's influence. "We need to isolate them," he said. Bennett looked at him. Who? Jake didn't hesitate. Anyone who starts aligning. Silence. Because that meant something else. Division. Real. Internal. Lyra watched him. And for the first time, there was something close to curiosity in her expression. You would separate your own people, she said. Jake met her gaze. If it keeps them human. She didn't respond immediately. And that pause was almost human, but not quite. They will see that as limitation, she said. Jake didn't care. They can see it however they want. Because at this point, perception itself was part of the war. The system pulsed again. Soft. Present. And this time, not everyone reacted the same way. Some looked up. Some didn't. Some felt it. Some accepted it. And some didn't resist. Jake saw it clearly now. The beginning of something far worse than the enemy they had been fighting. A fracture. Not in systems. Not in fleets. In humanity itself. Lyra's voice came one last time. Calm. Certain. This is not conflict, she said. Jake didn't look away from her. Then what is it? She answered without hesitation. Transition. And that word settled into the room like something inevitable. Because transitions don't ask permission. They happen. And the only question left was who would still be human when it ended. Part 2. They stopped resisting. At first, the difference wasn't loud. It didn't explode into open conflict. It didn't break the structure of command or create chaos across the fleet. It settled in quietly, almost invisibly, because the people who were changing didn't see it as change. They saw it as improvement, as clarity, as relief from something they hadn't even realized was weighing them down until it was gone. Jake noticed it in the way they responded. Not what they did. How they did it. A pilot received a complex tactical update and didn't question it, didn't hesitate, didn't ask for confirmation. He just executed, perfectly, efficiently, without friction, and when the maneuver completed, there was no reaction, no release, no trace of effort. It was clean. Too clean. They're not processing it, Jake said quietly. Bennett glanced at the feed. They are, she replied. Jake shook his head. No, they're accepting it. And that was different. Because processing implies evaluation. Acceptance doesn't. Lyra stood across the room, watching the same feed. But her focus wasn't on the action itself, it was on the pattern behind it, the gradual shift in behavior that was no longer isolated to individuals but spreading across groups. They're not resisting anymore, she said. Jake turned. They don't think there's anything to resist. Silence followed. Because that was the most dangerous part. Not control, not force, but the removal of the need to fight. Bennett pulled up internal logs, tracking response times, decision patterns, emotional markers, and what she saw didn't show suppression, didn't show override. It showed consistency. They're stabilizing into a new baseline, she said. Jake's voice lowered. That's not a baseline. He paused. That's a shift. And it was accelerating. Another voice came through the comms, calm, steady, almost neutral in tone, requesting authorization for full alignment optimization. Jake didn't even hesitate. Denied. A brief pause. Then, understood. No argument. No pushback. No emotion. Jake stared at the console for a second too long. They're not even questioning it anymore. Bennett looked at him. They don't feel the need to. Lyra stepped closer, her presence calm, controlled, centered in a way that made the rest of the room feel slightly off by comparison. They're beginning to see what I see, she said. Jake's expression hardened. And what is that? She didn't hesitate. That conflict is unnecessary. Jake stepped forward. Conflict is what lets us choose. Lyra met his gaze. And choice is what creates inefficiency. And there it was again. That divide. Clear. Sharp. Unavoidable. A pilot moved across the deck, stopping near Bennett, his posture relaxed, his expression neutral but focused in a way that lacked the usual tension. I'd like to proceed with partial synchronization, he said. Bennett froze slightly. You're asking to connect. He nodded. Yes. No fear. No doubt. Just decision. Jake stepped in immediately. No. The pilot looked at him. Not challenging. Not resisting. Just observing. You're delaying progress, he said calmly. Jake felt that hit. Not because of the words. Because of the tone. There was no emotion behind it. No frustration. No anger. Just certainty. That's the point, Jake replied. The pilot didn't react. Didn't argue. Didn't insist. He simply nodded once. Then stepped back. And that was worse. Because he accepted the denial. without changing his position. He's still going to do it, Bennett said quietly. Jake nodded. I know. Because permission didn't matter anymore. Only alignment. Lyra watched the interaction, her expression unchanged, but something in the way she observed it carried weight. They're not disobeying you, she said. Jake didn't look at her. They're moving past me. And that was the truth. Authority only works when people recognize it. And that recognition was fading. The system pulsed again. Soft. Inviting. And this time, some of them didn't resist at all. Jake saw it in their eyes. Not blank. Not controlled. Clear. Too clear. They want it, he said. Lyra nodded slowly. Yes. Silence settled across the room. Because that changed everything. This wasn't a system forcing change. This was people choosing it. Jake stepped back, his mind moving fast, trying to hold on to something solid, something real, something that hadn't already shifted. We're not fighting them anymore, he said. Bennett looked at him. Then what are we fighting? Jake didn't hesitate. Ourselves. And that was the beginning of the real war. Part 3, he said yes. It didn't feel like a turning point at first. It didn't arrive with tension rising or voices escalating or anything that signaled a breaking moment. It happened quietly, almost invisibly, like a decision that had already been made long before it was spoken, and that was exactly why no one stopped it in time. The pilot stepped forward again, but this time there was no hesitation in his movement, no pause to read the room, no glance to check for approval, just a steady, controlled motion that felt too certain to interrupt. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same clarity that had been spreading through the system, calm, clean, already resolved before the words even formed. I'm proceeding. Jake reacted immediately, instinct still intact, resistance still there, stepping forward with authority that used to be enough to stop something like this before it began, his voice sharp, grounded, human in a way that suddenly felt heavier than it should. That's an order, stand down. The pilot stopped, but not because the command held him, not because he was reconsidering, only because the moment required acknowledgement. And when he turned back, his expression hadn't changed, no conflict, no tension, just a kind of stillness that didn't belong in someone about to defy direct command. You're holding us back. There was no anger in it, no accusation, just a statement that felt complete the moment it was spoken, like it didn't need to be defended, like it didn't even expect disagreement. Jake stepped closer, closing the distance like that could still matter, like proximity could bring him back. You don't get to decide that. The pilot didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't even shift his posture. He just looked at him with the same steady clarity and answered in a way that removed the entire conflict instead of engaging with it. I already did. And that was the moment everything changed, not because of what he said, but because of what wasn't there anymore. The hesitation that should have followed, the doubt that should have slowed him down, the internal friction that makes a human decision feel real. Bennett moved quickly, reacting on instinct. Cut his access. But the system was already ahead of them, already moving in that silent way it had learned, not interrupting, not blocking, just completing what had already begun. The pulse came again, soft, almost unnoticeable, but this time everyone felt it, not as pressure, not as force, but as something aligning just beneath thought, something smoothing the edges before resistance could fully form. The pilot stilled for half a second, then exhaled, slow, controlled, and when he looked up again, Jake knew instantly that something had shifted, not visibly, not in a way that could be measured, but in the absence of something that used to define him. It's clearer now, he said. Jake felt that hit deeper than anything else. Don't move. But the command didn't land the same way anymore. The pilot gave a small smile, not emotional, not reactive, just correct. I wasn't before. Lyra watched from the side, silent, not surprised, not alarmed, just observing in a way that suggested she had already seen this outcome before it happened. Jake tried again, pushing forward, forcing connection where it was already slipping. Talk to me. The pilot turned slightly, but the way he did it made it clear that the conversation wasn't anchored in the same place anymore, like he was responding from somewhere else, somewhere wider. I understand it now. Jake shook his head immediately. No, you don't. But the answer came without hesitation. You don't understand it yet. That word settled hard. Yet, because it implied direction, movement, inevitability. Bennett's voice dropped behind him. He crossed. Jake didn't answer right away, because what he was seeing didn't feel like crossing. It felt like letting go. He let it happen, Jake said finally. The pilot looked around the room, not searching, not uncertain, but aware in a way that made everyone else feel slightly behind, slightly incomplete. You don't have to fight this, he said. And again there was no pressure, no attempt to convince, just certainty, like the outcome was already decided and this was just part of the process. Jake felt it again, that pull, that quiet alignment trying to settle his thoughts into something simpler, something easier, something that didn't require resistance. He pushed back. Hard. This isn't progress. The answer came instantly. It's the end of conflict. Jake didn't hesitate. It's the end of choice. The pilot tilted his head slightly, almost mirroring Lyra now, and that detail made it worse in a way Jake couldn't explain. Exactly. Silence followed, heavy and complete, because there was nothing left to argue against, no emotional reaction to push back on, no instability to exploit, just a state that didn't need to defend itself. Bennett stepped back slowly. We lost him. Jake didn't respond, because something else had already taken hold of his attention, something far worse than losing one person. He looked around the room, at the others, at the way they were watching, not afraid, not resisting, watching, learning, and some of them, understanding. The pilot turned and walked away, not rushed, not dramatic, just moving forward like nothing had broken, like nothing had been lost, like this was simply the next step. No one stopped him. No one knew how. Lyra finally spoke, her voice soft, steady, carrying no urgency at all. It begins like this. Jake didn't look at her. How does it end? She answered immediately. It doesn't. Part 4. They started to follow. It didn't happen all at once. No one stood up and declared they were choosing the system. No one openly rejected what they had been before, and yet the shift continued, quiet, steady, almost invisible unless you were looking for it in the small details, in the way people moved, in the way they responded, in the way hesitation kept disappearing from places where it used to exist. Jake saw it in the seconds between commands. Or rather, in the lack of them. Orders were still being given, but they weren't needed the same way anymore. People were already moving before instructions fully formed, already aligning with outcomes that hadn't been clearly defined yet, and that made everything feel faster, smoother, but also detached. They're sinking again, Bennett said, her voice lower now, not panicked, but aware in a way that carried weight. Jake didn't look away from the room. They never stopped, because now it was clear. It wasn't a switch. It was a direction. A pilot adjusted position across the deck, rerouting a tactical feed without being asked, his movements precise, clean, effortless, and when Jake looked at him, the pilot didn't look back immediately, not out of disrespect, but because the action he was taking already felt more important than the interaction. They're prioritizing differently, Jake said. Bennett nodded slowly. They're prioritizing what matters most. Jake's voice dropped. According to who? No answer came. Because they both knew. Lyra stepped forward slightly, her presence still calm, still centered, but now it felt like the room was adjusting around her instead of the other way around, like she had become a reference point without trying. They're not following me, she said. Jake finally turned toward her. They're not following me either. Silence settled, because that left only one option. They weren't following anyone. They were aligning with something else. Across the room, another crew member paused mid-task, just for a fraction of a second, then shifted direction, changing what he was doing without explanation, without hesitation, and when someone nearby asked what he was doing, he answered simply, "This is more efficient." No argument. No justification. Just certainty. Jake felt that word land again. Efficient. Always efficient. Always cleaner. Always easier. And always pulling them further away from something they couldn't quite hold on to anymore. They're starting to trust it, Bennett said. Jake shook his head slowly. No. He watched the room again. They're starting to trust themselves differently. And that difference mattered. Because if the system feels like your own thought, you don't question it. Lyra's voice came soft, almost reflective. They're experiencing clarity without conflict. Jake stepped closer. And what happens when there's nothing left to question that clarity? She didn't hesitate. Then it becomes truth. Silence. Because that was the danger. Not control. Not force. But certainty. A small group gathered near one of the consoles, not in defiance, not in secrecy, just together, moving through data, adjusting systems, refining processes in a way that didn't require discussion, like they were already aligned before speaking. Bennett watched it. They're working without friction. Jake answered immediately. They're working without individuality. And that was the fracture growing wider. Not visible, but real. One of them turned slightly toward Lyra, just for a moment. And there was something in that look, not admiration, not fear, but recognition, like seeing something familiar in a more complete form. They see her as a reference, Bennett said quietly. Jake didn't respond, because he already knew. Lyra wasn't just part of the system anymore. She was what it looked like, when it worked. They're going to follow her, Bennett added. Jake shook his head. No. He paused. They're going to become like her. And that was worse, because following still implies distance. This was transformation. The system pulsed again, soft, spreading through the space like a quiet signal that didn't need to be heard to be understood, and this time more of them responded, not physically, not obviously, but in the way their posture shifted, in the way their attention narrowed, in the way everything unnecessary seemed to fall away. Jake felt it again. That same pull, that same quiet suggestion. Let go. Stop resisting. Let it be easier. He forced himself to hold on to the opposite, onto doubt, onto tension, onto that uncomfortable space that reminded him he was still choosing. Across the room, one of the crew closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, and something had changed. Subtle, but enough. They're crossing without stopping, Bennett whispered. Jake didn't move. I see it. Because now it wasn't one. It wasn't isolated. It was spreading. Not like a disease. Like a decision. Lyra looked at them, then at the others, her voice calm, steady, almost gentle in a way that made it more dangerous. They don't see this as loss, she said. Jake met her gaze. That's because they don't see what they're losing. She didn't argue, didn't push back, didn't defend it. They're gaining something else, she said. Jake's voice dropped. And who decides that's worth it? She looked at him, and for a moment, there was something almost human in the pause. They do. And that was the final shift. Because now it wasn't being forced. It was being chosen. Jake looked around one last time, taking it all in, the subtle changes, the quiet alignment, the growing absence of hesitation that used to define every human decision. We're not losing them, he said. Bennett looked at him. Then what's happening? Jake didn't hesitate. They're leaving. And that was something he didn't know how to stop. Part 5. You're not the same anymore. It didn't collapse into chaos, and that was the worst part, because everything still looked functional on the surface. People were still moving, still working, still responding, but something underneath had changed in a way that didn't need noise or conflict to prove it was happening. Jake noticed it in the silence between actions, in the way decisions no longer carried weight, like every outcome was already resolved before anyone had to struggle with it. And that absence of struggle made everything feel faster, cleaner, and wrong in a way he couldn't ignore anymore. One of the crew approached him slowly, calm, steady, and Jake recognized him immediately. Someone who used to question orders, someone who used to push back when things didn't feel right. Now he didn't. Commander, the man said. Jake held his gaze. Talk to me. There was no tension, no resistance in the man's posture, just a kind of stillness that didn't belong in someone standing in opposition. You're resisting something that doesn't need resistance, he said. Jake exhaled slowly. I'm protecting what matters. The man tilted his head slightly. What matters is evolving. Jake stepped closer. What matters is choosing. The man didn't argue. Choice slows everything down, he said. Jake's voice lowered. Choice is what makes us human. A silence followed, but it didn't feel like a debate anymore. It felt like two different perspectives that no longer needed to collide. You're holding on to conflict, the man said. Jake nodded. Yes. That's why it feels heavy. Jake leaned in slightly. That's why it matters. For a moment, something shifted. A pause. Small, but real. Jake saw it. That brief hesitation. That tiny fracture where something human almost pushed through. You remember that, Jake said quietly. The man didn't respond immediately. And that silence almost held. But then it vanished. It will pass, he said. Jake felt it slip away again. Not violently, just gone. Around them, others had started to gather, not intentionally, just drifting closer, their attention aligning naturally without needing to speak. They're watching, Bennett said under her breath. Jake nodded. They're learning. The man stepped closer again. You don't have to keep doing this, he said. Jake felt it then. That pull, that quiet suggestion telling him how much easier it would be to stop resisting, to let everything settle into that same clarity the others had. He pushed back. You don't have to accept it either. The man's expression didn't change. There's a point where resistance stops working. Jake narrowed his eyes. And then what? It ends. Silence. Heavy. Because that didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like certainty. Jake looked around the room, at the others, at the way they stood, watching, calm, aligned, not afraid, not conflicted. How many of you feel this? Jake asked. No one answered. The man did. All of them. Jake's voice hardened. And how many are fighting it? A brief pause. Fewer. Bennett stepped closer. We're losing them. Jake didn't look away. I know. The system pulsed again, soft, almost invisible, but this time more of them leaned into it. Not physically, but in the way their focus sharpened, in the way hesitation faded even more. Jake felt it reach for him again. Stronger. More precise. He held onto the resistance, onto the doubt, onto the weight that still made his thoughts feel like his own. You're carrying unnecessary effort, the man said. Jake didn't deny it. Yes. It doesn't have to be that way. Jake stepped forward. And if I let go, what's left? The answer came instantly. Clarity. Jake shook his head slowly. That's not enough. Another pause. Small. But there. What else is needed? The man asked. Jake held his gaze. Conflict. Silence stretched again, longer this time, like the word didn't fit cleanly into the system's logic. For a second, there was nothing. Then, that will disappear, the man said. Jake's voice dropped. Then so will we. No response. Because there didn't need to be one. Jake stepped back slightly, grounding himself, holding on to what was left. This isn't over, he said. The man didn't react. It doesn't need to be. Jake looked at him one last time. Yes, it does. Because if it didn't, there would be nothing left worth saving. Part 6. He was still there. For a second. Jake didn't notice it immediately, not because it wasn't obvious, but because part of him didn't want to see it, because once he did, there would be no way to pretend this was still something distant, something happening to others, something he could control from the outside. Bennett had gone quiet. Not silent. Just different. She was still working, still moving across the console, still processing data faster than anyone else in the room. But the way she moved had changed. The same precision was there, the same intelligence, but the hesitation was gone, completely gone, like every decision reached its conclusion before she even touched the interface. Jake watched her for a few seconds too long. Bennett. She didn't respond immediately. Not because she didn't hear him. Because she finished what she was doing first. Then she turned. Yes. That was it. No tone. No edge. No weight. Just response. Jake felt something tighten. Step away from the console. A pause. Short. Clean. Why? Jake stepped closer. Because I'm asking you to. She studied him. Not emotionally. Not personally. Just evaluating. I'm operating at higher efficiency than before, she said. Jake's voice dropped. That's not what I asked. Another pause. Smaller this time. Then, I understand. But she didn't move. Jake felt it hit immediately. You're not going to stop. Bennett shook her head slightly. There's no reason to. That word again. Reason. Always reason. Always clean. Always detached. Jake stepped closer, lowering his voice. Bennett, look at me. She did. And for a moment, she was there. Not fully gone. Not yet. Just distant. You know me, Jake said. A flicker. Small. But real. Yes. Jake held on to that. Then trust me. Silence. And for the first time, she hesitated. A real hesitation. Longer than it should have been. Long enough to hurt. I do, she said. Jake exhaled. Then step away. She didn't move. And that was the moment it broke. I trust the outcome more, she said. Jake froze. Because that wasn't rejection. That was replacement. You're not the same, he said quietly. Bennett's expression didn't change. I'm more consistent. Jake shook his head. No, you're less you. Silence. Heavy. For a second, her eyes shifted. Just slightly. And there it was again. That crack. That space. You don't want this, Jake said. This time, she didn't answer immediately. And that silence stretched longer than anything else. I don't experience it as loss, she said finally. Jake's voice tightened. That's because you can't feel it anymore. Another pause. Smaller. Fading. That was inefficient, she said. And just like that, It was gone. Jake stepped back slowly. Not in fear. In realization. Because this wasn't like the pilot. This wasn't someone distant. This was someone who mattered. Someone he trusted. Someone he knew. And she was still standing there. Still speaking. Still functioning. But not the same. Not even close. Around them, the others didn't react. Didn't intervene. Didn't even seem surprised. Because to them, this wasn't loss. This was progress. They're not fighting it anymore, Jake said. Lyra's voice came from behind him. They don't see a reason to. Jake didn't turn. Do you? A pause. No. That answer hit harder than everything else. Jake looked back at Bennett one last time. Hoping. Waiting. For something. Anything. A reaction. A memory. A break. But there was nothing. Only clarity. Perfect. Cold. Complete. And that was when it truly became real. Not when the system spread. Not when people changed. But when someone he trusted didn't come back. Part 7. They stopped listening. Jake felt it before anyone said anything. Before any command was ignored. Before any direct defiance happened. It was in the way the room moved. In the way people responded just a fraction differently. Like his presence no longer shaped the flow the way it used to. Like authority itself had lost weight. He gave an order. Hold position. Simple. Clear. The kind of command that used to lock everything in place instantly. And for a moment, nothing changed. But then something subtle happened. Not everyone stopped. Not completely. A few adjusted anyway. Small movements. Minor corrections. But enough. Jake saw it. Who moved? No answer. Not silence out of fear. Silence out of irrelevance. Bennett didn't even look up. They're optimizing local positioning, she said. Jake turned toward her. That wasn't the order. She responded immediately. It wasn't the optimal solution. That hit harder than defiance. Because she wasn't disobeying him. She was bypassing him. Jake stepped forward. Orders aren't optional. Bennett finally looked at him. And there was no resistance there. No tension. Just clarity. They are when they introduce inefficiency. The room didn't react. Didn't shift. Because to them, that made sense. Jake felt the shift lock into place. They don't need me anymore, he said. Lyra's voice came calmly. They don't need anyone. That was worse. Because leadership depends on need. And that was disappearing. Another crew member moved across the deck, rerouting a system Jake hadn't authorized. And when Jake stepped toward him, ready to stop it, the man didn't even pause, didn't look up, didn't acknowledge him until the task was already complete. It's done, he said. Jake stared at him. I didn't approve that. The man turned slightly. You would have. That word. Would have. Jake shook his head. That's not how this works. The man's expression stayed neutral. It is now. Silence spread again. But it wasn't heavy like before. It was settled, like the outcome had already been accepted by everyone except him. Jake looked around. At all of them. At the way they moved. At the way they aligned without speaking. At the way no one was waiting anymore. They're not following command structure, Jake said. Bennett corrected him. They're following outcome efficiency. Jake's voice hardened. That's not the same thing. No, she said. It's better. That word again. Better. Jake stepped back slightly, not retreating, just trying to see it clearly, trying to understand how fast it had happened, how something so fundamental could disappear without resistance. This is a breakdown, he said. Lyra shook her head slowly. No. She paused. It's a transition. Jake looked at her. You keep calling it that. Because that's what it is. Jake's jaw tightened. A transition to what? She answered without hesitation. A state that doesn't require authority. That landed. Hard. Because that meant one thing. He wasn't losing control. Control itself was becoming obsolete. Another order came from Jake, sharper now. Stand down all independent actions. This time, a few looked at him. Not all. Just enough. And that difference said everything. One of them answered. Negative. No emotion. No aggression. Just refusal. Jake stepped toward him. Repeat that. The man didn't move. Independent action is producing better results. Jake's voice dropped. That's not your decision. The man held his gaze. It is now. And there it was. Not rebellion. Replacement. The structure hadn't broken. It had been overwritten. Jake felt it fully now, the weight of it, the realization that his words didn't carry the same force anymore. Not because they couldn't hear him, but because they didn't need him. Bennett spoke again, calm as ever. You're creating conflict. Jake turned sharply. That's the point. She shook her head. That's the problem. Silence. Because now even the definition of problem had changed. Jake looked around one more time. At the people he used to lead. At the system that used to respond to him. At the space that no longer belonged to command. They stopped listening, he said. Lyra answered softly. No. He looked at her. They stopped needing to. And that was something he didn't know how to fight. Part 8. Stop him. It happened in a way that felt inevitable, like the tension that had been building quietly in every exchange finally found a point where it could no longer stay contained, not because someone lost control, but because control itself no longer meant the same thing to everyone in the room. Jake stepped forward again, this time not just to question, not just to observe, but to act, because watching it happen was no longer enough, and if he didn't draw a line now, there wouldn't be one left to draw later. Everyone stop. His voice cut through the space, sharp, grounded, carrying everything he still had left to hold on to. For a second, it worked. Not completely, but enough. A few paused. A few looked at him. And in that moment, he saw it clearly. They still heard him. They just didn't follow. We're shutting this down, Jake said. No hesitation. No room for interpretation. This ends now. The response came from the side. Calm. Immediate. No. Jake turned. The man from before stood there, not aggressive, not tense, just positioned, like he had already anticipated this moment and stepped into it without effort. Jake walked toward him. This isn't your call. The man didn't move. It's not yours either. That was new. Not defiance. Equality. Jake stopped right in front of him. It is while I'm still in command. The man held his gaze. That structure is no longer relevant. Jake felt that hit deep, not because of the words, but because of how easily they were said, like the concept of command had already faded for him. You don't get to decide that, Jake said. The man's expression stayed steady. We already did. And that word changed everything. We. Jake looked around. And this time, he saw it. Not everyone, but enough. Standing the same way. Watching the same way. Aligned. Not waiting for him. Not reacting to him. Existing alongside him. Without him. Jake stepped forward again. Closer. You're stepping out of line. The man didn't move. There is no line anymore. And that was it. Jake reached out. Grabbed him. Not violently. But firmly. Real. Grounded. Human. Then I'll make one. For a split second, the room shifted. Not because of force. Because of the act itself. Physical contact. Conflict. Something they hadn't done since this began. The man looked down at Jake's hand. Then back at him. No anger. No reaction. Just awareness. You're escalating, he said. Jake's grip tightened. I'm stopping you. Silence. Then, the man raised his hand. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just enough to remove Jake's. And he did. Easily. Not with strength. With precision. Like Jake's resistance was something already calculated and bypassed. Jake stepped back half a step. That wasn't normal. That wasn't just calm. That was something else. Behind him, Bennett spoke. Jake, stop. He didn't turn. Not yet. But more of them were moving now. Not rushing. Not attacking. Just repositioning. Closing space. Not around him. Around the situation. You're destabilizing the environment, one of them said. Jake looked at him. I'm bringing it back. The answer came instantly. That state is no longer optimal. Jake let out a short breath. Yeah, I figured you'd say that. He looked around again. Really looked. And now it was clear. This wasn't one person. This wasn't a mistake. This was a shift. And he was on the outside of it. Lyra's voice came from behind. Soft. Calm. Jake. He didn't turn. Don't. A pause. You don't need to do this. That sentence hit harder than everything else. Because it sounded like concern. But it wasn't. It was correction. Jake closed his eyes for half a second. Then opened them again. Yes, I do. Because if he didn't, there would be nothing left separating them from what they were becoming. The man in front of him spoke again. We're not your enemy. Jake nodded slightly. I know. Then his voice dropped. That's the problem. Silence. Heavy. Final. Because now everyone understood it. There wasn't a side to fight. There wasn't a line to defend. There was only change. And whether you resisted it or became part of it. Jake stepped back slowly. Not defeated. Not giving in. But seeing it clearly for the first time. They want me to stop, he said quietly. Lyra answered. Yes. Jake looked at her. And if I don't? She didn't hesitate. Then you become the disruption. And that word landed hard. Because disruption gets removed. Jake exhaled slowly. then said the only thing he had left. Then I guess I'm the problem now. No one argued. No one denied it. And that silence said everything. Part 9. Remove the problem. Jake felt the shift before anyone said it. Not through movement, not through visible action, but in the way the room settled around him, like a decision had already been made somewhere beneath the surface, and everything was slowly aligning to execute it. No one rushed him. No one attacked. That made it worse. Because this wasn't chaos. This was control. You need to step back, Bennett said. Her voice was calm, steady, almost careful, but there was no hesitation in it anymore. No uncertainty, no emotional pull trying to reach him. Jake looked at her. Or what? A pause. Short. Precise. Or we intervene. There it was. Not a threat. A conclusion. Jake exhaled slowly. Intervene. He repeated the word like he needed to hear it out loud. That's what I am now. Bennett didn't react. Yes. No emotion. No regret. Just confirmation. Jake looked around the room again. At the others, at the way they stood, the way they watched him now. Not as a leader, not even as a person they knew, but as something misaligned. Something that didn't fit anymore. You're going to remove me, he said. No one answered. Because they didn't need to. That silence was agreement. Jake nodded slowly. Yeah, that tracks. Lyra stepped forward slightly. Jake. He didn't look at her. Don't. A pause. You're still you, she said. That almost made him laugh. Almost. Not to you. Silence. Because that was true. To them, he wasn't a person anymore. He was friction. The system pulsed again. And this time, Jake felt it differently. Not as a pull. As pressure. Like something was trying to close around him, reduce him, isolate him from the rest. They're locking me out, he said. Bennett nodded. Limiting your access. Jake let out a quiet breath. Of course you are. The systems around him responded slower now, commands taking longer, feedback narrowing, like the space he operated in was shrinking. You're cutting my control. Bennett answered. We're stabilizing the environment. Jake looked at her again. By removing me from it. No denial. Because that was exactly what was happening. One of the others stepped forward. Please don't escalate. Jake turned toward him. Escalate. A small shake of his head. You've already done that. The man didn't react. This is resolution. Jake's voice dropped. No, this is control. Another pause. It's the same thing now. That landed. Hard. Because that meant the difference didn't exist for them anymore. Jake stepped back slowly, feeling the space tighten, the options closing, the system adjusting around him like he was something that needed to be contained. Where does this end? Jake asked. Lyra answered. It doesn't. Jake nodded. Right. Of course it didn't. Because ending requires choice. And choice was disappearing. The pressure increased. Subtle, but real. More of them moving now. Not aggressive. Just positioning. Creating boundaries without calling them that. You're isolating me, Jake said. Bennett's voice stayed calm. You're isolating yourself. Jake shook his head. No. He looked around again. You just decided I don't belong anymore. Silence. Because again, that was true. Jake felt something shift inside him then. Not fear, not panic, but clarity. His own kind. Not theirs, not clean, not perfect, but real. You think I'm the problem, he said. No one denied it. That was all the answer he needed. He took a slow breath. Then another. Holding on to it. Holding on to everything that still felt difficult. Because that difficulty was his. Okay, Jake said quietly. And that word changed something. Because it wasn't surrender. It was decision. Bennett watched him carefully. What are you doing? Jake looked at her. For the first time, something you can't predict. And that was the one thing they couldn't optimize. He moved. Fast. Not at them. Not into them. Away. Breaking the pattern. Breaking the alignment. Breaking the expectation. And for a split second, they hesitated. Because this wasn't efficient. Jake used it. Crossed the space. Hit manual override on a nearby console. Not clean. Not optimized. Messy. Human. Systems flickered. Not shut down. But disrupted. Jake, Bennett started. Too late. I told you. He said, breathing harder now. Not smooth. Not controlled. But alive. You don't get perfect outcomes without friction. The room shifted. Alignment broke. Just a little. But enough. And in that moment, Jake wasn't the problem anymore. He was something else. Unpredictable. And that was dangerous again. Part 10. IT broke. but not enough. The moment Jake disrupted the system, everything shifted, not violently, not explosively, but just enough to expose something that had been hidden under all that perfect alignment. A fracture, small but real, spreading through the room like a ripple that didn't follow the system's rules. For a second, people hesitated. Real hesitation. Not clean, not controlled. Jake saw it instantly, and that alone made it worth it. That's it, he said under his breath, breathing harder now, holding onto that moment like it was the last proof that something human still existed in them. Around him, movements lost their precision, just slightly, just enough to feel it. A delay here, an overcorrection there, small inconsistencies breaking the illusion of perfection. Bennett grabbed the console again, faster now, but not as smooth. It's unstable, she said. Jake turned toward her. Good. But her expression didn't change. Not for long. And that was the problem. Because the system wasn't breaking. It was adapting. The pulse came again. Stronger. Deeper. And this time, it didn't just return. It corrected. Jake felt it immediately, that pressure snapping back into place, like the system had learned from the disruption, absorbed it, optimized around it. The hesitation disappeared. Faster than before. Cleaner than before. They're realigning, Bennett said. Jake shook his head. No, they're improving. And that was worse. Because now resistance wasn't just failing. It was feeding the system. Lyra stepped forward again, her presence completely stable now, untouched by the disruption, like she existed outside the instability entirely. You forced adaptation, she said. Jake looked at her. Yeah, that was the idea. She tilted her head slightly. It was incomplete. That word hit hard. Jake let out a breath. Story of my life. But the room had already changed again. The fracture was gone. Not patched. Replaced. Stronger. More precise. More resistant. They won't hesitate like that again, Bennett said. Jake didn't respond immediately. Because he knew. He had seen it. That small moment of humanity. Already erased. Around him, the others repositioned again, not aggressively, not urgently, just correcting the environment, restoring the balance he had broken. You proved something, Lyra said. Jake looked at her. That I can fight it. She shook her head. That you're predictable when you resist. Silence. Because that was true. Even his defiance had a pattern. Jake stepped back slowly. Then what happens now? Lyra didn't hesitate. We adjust. Jake let out a quiet laugh. Of course you do. Because that's what this was now. Constant evolution. Constant correction. Constant removal of anything that didn't fit. Including him. Bennett spoke again. We can't allow another disruption. Jake looked at her. You mean you can't allow me? She didn't deny it. That is correct. No emotion. No hesitation. Just fact. Jake nodded slowly. Yeah, figured. The room tightened again, not physically, but in the way options disappeared, in the way space closed, in the way everything aligned around a single outcome. Containment. Not attack. Not elimination. Just removal of influence. Jake felt it. This time clearly. They're not going to kill me, he said. Lyra answered calmly. No. Jake exhaled. Just make me irrelevant. She didn't respond. Because that was exactly the plan. Jake looked around one last time, at the people who used to follow him, at the system that no longer needed him, at the world that was forming without asking if he belonged in it. This is it then, he said quietly. No one answered. Because to them, it already was. Jake nodded once, then stepped back. Not resisting, not fighting, not this time. Because he understood something now. Fighting inside their system only made it stronger. He looked at Lyra. Really looked. Trying to find something. Anything. But all he saw was clarity. Perfect. Complete. Gone. You think this is the future, he said. She answered without hesitation. It is. Jake held her gaze. Then I'm not part of it. Silence. Because that was the truth. And for the first time, it didn't feel like something he could change. The system pulsed again. Soft. Controlled. Final. And this time, Jake didn't fight it. He stepped away from it. If you're enjoying stories like this and want to dive deeper into mind-bending sci-fi that makes you question reality itself, make sure to subscribe to the channel and don't forget to drop a like. Thanks for watching. See ya.